When I was about 17, my mom and I moved to a large city in the US. I won't name the city due to what took place, but it's a city most people are familiar with. Anyway, we moved to this city to start our new lives as my mom had bought a business and would then take ownership. This meant that I would also have to transfer schools, which was the hardest part of the move. Saying goodbye to your longtime friends paired with all of those super great hormonal imbalances of your high school years. What made it worse was that I was a junior when I moved and would have to spend my senior year with no one I knew. The last day of school came around. I said goodbye to my friends and then rushed to the airport with my mom. The instant I switched schools, I became a totally different person. I was that one outgoing girl who loved her friends only to become a random nobody who sat alone at lunch. The school itself was okay, but it was nothing like my old school. I had made a few acquaintances, but nobody I actually enjoyed talking to like my other friends. One day, I had been at lunch eating by myself when, out of nowhere, a boy I had never seen before decides to sit with me. He introduced himself as Dave and asked if he could sit with me. I tell him yes, and he begins talking about himself and claimed he was also a new student here. We spoke to each other until lunch was over, where he had walked me to my class, which I found thoughtful. It's safe to say I found Dave very relatable the more we spoke. He had the same interests and even the same family issues. He seemed very sweet, and while he was a bit off, he wasn't a threat or anything. However, little did I know that would be further from the truth. One day, Dave, out of nowhere, had texted me asking about my bra size. I told him I wasn't comfortable answering that, to which he then instantly apologized and changed the topic. But as time progressed, he'd bring up the topic even though I wouldn't want to talk about it. It eventually came to a point where I chose not to speak with him even when he messaged me first. The same drill applied when he approached me at school too. Eventually, days went by and for some reason I didn't see Dave at school anymore. I assumed that he had finally gotten the hint and just stayed clear of me. However, I was dead wrong. The following night, I had been at home on my computer doing a project for chemistry class when I heard something hit my window. Looking back, it kinda sounded like a pebble hitting my window. After all, it was raining outside, so I assumed it was probably the wind blowing away debris. However, it then happened a second time, this time much louder. I get up from my bed and walk over to the window, and there, crouched, is someone who I could only describe as Dave. He had on his hoodie and gave me an unnerving smile when he saw me. I screamed at the top of my lungs as I saw him and ran to my mom's room to wake her up. My mom is the type of person who was overprotective of her children, so when I told her, she was rightfully pissed. Why my dad isn't home is another story, but my mom puts on her shoes and goes out of the house with a baseball bat. All the while, she's screaming bloody murder, telling whoever was here to leave or she won't hesitate to knock their teeth in. My mom is a fighter and won't put up with anyone's BS, so when she said that, she meant it. After what felt like hours, she finally came back inside hugging me and that whoever it was gone. Needless to say, we still felt safer calling the cops and they take down our info and what had happened. Our motion sensor light didn't work, so it couldn't alert my mom when someone was outside our house. My mom pulled me out of school for a week and demanded the school sort out the situation with Dave. Turns out, Dave had been in and out of the school for the past year and was not at all a new student. He had been suspended many times for reasons like this, only to get back in for good behavior. How he found my house is a mystery, and quite frankly, I don't want to know. My best guess is that he somehow followed me home. That, or he managed to track me. Either way, this is and probably will be the scariest stalker experience I've ever had. I hadn't even known Dave for a month, and already something came up. I still think about this incident from time to time, and just wish I'd be back at my old school. A few weeks later, I moved to another school where it wasn't the best, but better by a landslide than the other one. Up until now, I try my best to stay clear of social media and outings as I'm still paranoid. This isn't a big county, meaning it was common to run into someone you knew. I hope I never see Dave again. This took place in my sophomore year of high school at an all-boys academy. It was mainly a school for people who wanted to get jobs that had to do with tech or major appliances. It was not at all a big or a public school. It was a private school tucked away in the suburbs of northern Montana. During my time there, I had made several friends and actually learned something I enjoyed. The teachers there, however, weren't the best at their job. They taught well, but got easily annoyed when a student would go up to them for help or had a question. In other words, it wasn't like those stereotypical classrooms you'd see in shows where help was available whenever you needed it. In this school, you either went hard or went home. There was no in between. One day, my friend, who I'll call Jordan, had texted me before lunch telling me that he had found a new spot to hang out. This immediately got my attention, as whenever he was interested in something, it meant business. During that day at lunch, he had brought me over to this spot he was telling me about, which was in this wooded area right behind the school. Our school was located near this local park where people would commonly go hiking in. It was also a spot for students to go and smoke during lunch, and even though it wasn't allowed, it wasn't enforced. The spot Jordan was talking about was this little area by a pond under some trees. We of course start smoking and laughing our asses off to funny videos only high schoolers would find funny. As our lunch break was almost over, we looked to our right, and standing on the other side of the pond is a woman we had never seen before. The second she sees us, she comes walking ever so slowly towards our direction. She looked totally in distress and looked as if she hadn't eaten in weeks. She wore torn pants, a dirty brown shirt, and her hair was a mess. Our initial thought was that she was clearly on something. This was a school that was miles away from the nearest town, so there was no reason as to why she would be out here. Our theory was indeed correct, as the closer she came, the more intoxicated she appeared. She walks up to us in a very sluggish voice and asks us for help because she had been beat up by her boyfriend. This was the first red flag, as she looked beat up by life, not just by a boyfriend. We tell her that we were sorry and that we had to get back to class and that we couldn't do anything. However, she insisted that we help her, disregarding what we had said. This time, in a more direct tone, we tell her no and that we were just leaving. The look on her face that day will never leave us. It was a look of anger and rage, as if she wanted to hurt us. She then puts her hands on the back of her head and starts saying something in an unknown language. What she was saying, I wasn't sure, but needless to say, we get the hell out of there, but not before the woman seeing us. She then yells something to us and begins to forcefully shove her whole fist down her throat. This resulted in her puking all over the ground while crying her eyes out, still begging for help. Jordan and I instantly run back to the school where we knew we weren't being followed. When we get inside, we go to the main office and tell them about the woman in the back. Later that day, I remember seeing a police car and a white transportation van at the front of our school. As it turns out, She had escaped from a mental institution and had been off her medication for weeks. What her intentions were, we have no idea, but we were 90% sure they weren't good. That woman never came back near the school again, but I just hope she's doing well and getting the help she needs. This took place back in 2016 when I was a junior in high school. I was around 17, which is the typical age for an average junior. Our class was going on a day field trip to a nearby wooded area by a lake to learn about some plants and study them. It was for our earth science class, and the objective was to use the so-called skills we learned in class to identify which plants were which. It was kind of like a scavenger hunt, and the group with the most plants found got extra credit or something. Our teacher allowed us to split up, and my friend Colin and I wandered off to go explore. We had found one bizarre-looking plant and identified it as a passion flower, a common plant native to Florida. We continue our walk and eventually come to a clearing full of grass that was about knee-high. From there on, we had identified 2 other plants that we were supposed to find, and after about an hour of playing Pokemon Go, we decided to head back. It was around 5:30 and the sun was starting to set and the bus would be leaving at 6, meaning we had to get back soon. So there we are, walking through the thick brush when Colin stops me dead in my tracks and shushes me. "Dude, do you hear that?" Upon the crickets chirping, I listened closely and heard the sound of what I thought was crying. It was coming from the left, about maybe 25 feet away, deeper into the woods. Colin, being the invested person he was, decided to go see what it was. Figuring that it might have been another student in need of help, I decided to go along. We walked through the thick brush with twigs and branches hitting our faces the further we went. The closer we went through, the more clear the crying got. By now, the sun was almost set and we had to turn on our flashlights from our phones to light our way. Suddenly, Colin stops and puts his arm in front of me and tells me that it was coming from behind one of the trees. He points to a large tree about a few feet away and the crying was clearer than ever. I tell him that we shouldn't go over there and that something didn't feel right. Colin, being the tough guy he was, ignored my advice and walked over while I made my way back to the bus. Not even 30 seconds later, I hear Colin scream at the top of his lungs. I see Colin come running toward me, grabbing onto my hand and bolting it to the bus. All the while, I'm trying to question him while we practically ran for our lives, but he wouldn't answer me. As we were running, we could have sworn we heard something from behind us, but we genuinely didn't care. We thankfully made it back to the bus just in time, hyperventilating. There were a few students who looked concerned, but we refused to reveal anything, fearing we'd get into trouble. Throughout the bus ride home, I tried every attempt to convince him to tell me what he saw, but he gave no response. From that point forward, we didn't mention anything about this to anyone, even our parents. Colin and I are still friends and are now both in our last semester of college. Till this day, Colin still refuses to tell me as to what it was he saw, and I'm not sure if I'll ever know. Sometimes I'll look back on that day and think about going back to the lake to try and listen for the crying again, but I'm not sure I want to.